Well, Brian, this past week on Vice TV, Tuesday nights at 10 o'clock Eastern time, that is, the latest episode of Dark Side of the Ring was on superstar Billy Graham. And again, besides the fact that I love to watch these old clips of stuff that has not been shoved down our throats, and Graham was made for television, can we ring the bell on one debate right now? The best looking belt that the WWE, WWF, WWF ever had was the Billy Graham belt. That was one of those Nikita Molkovich belts. It just looked phenomenal on all this stuff.
It was a great looking belt. I love the way that belt looks, and it was perfect for its time. I do like the Winged Eagle belt, but again, I grew up during that era when that was the belt for, almost 10 years?
Oh, yeah, easily.
So, I mean, that was kind of the belt of my childhood, but I really like that one. Do you think that one looks better than, let's say, the NWA Globed, what did they call it? The
Globed Dome?
Globe
the
Dome
the domed globe. Yeah. I love those Molkovich belts, and the World Tag Team belts we had for Crockett were made by him also, and they hadn't been kept up as well as that one was. But I had replica sets made of those things. It's the only replica belts I've got, just because I love them so much. But it looked like a big piece of jewelry, and you don't get that look anymore, the texture and the et cetera. But with Graham, everything just looked so good. And they had video where they juxtaposed him and Dusty, him and Hogan especially. I mean, it was the point of the episode was that if he'd been the superstar Graham of 1974 in 1984, Vince would have made him Hulk Hogan. But Hogan took his gimmick. Ventura took his gimmick. Dusty took some of it. And I know people are going to say, what the fuck? Not body-wise, but the promo and the tie-dye. I mean, Graham was doing even tie-dye before almost anybody in wrestling. Maybe
well, his wife was doing the tie-dye. That was news, too, that she was the one doing the tie-dye stuff in the bathroom.
Yeah, but it was his gimmick that he put together. And now so many people, Scott Steiner at one point, and everybody on a wrestling show now is kind of doing something either from Graham or from somebody that did it from Graham. But at the time that he was doing that in wrestling, even when I first found wrestling magazines, the pictures of him, 1972, they're fucking tremendous. He looked different. It was a whole different thing. And one of the talking heads was his friend Steve Strong. They were workout buddies, but Steve Strong got runs in smaller territories as superstar Steve Strong, didn't he?
He did.
And, even Bill Dundee, he didn't do it directly, but Big Bad John, when they teamed him up with Bill Dundee, he started doing the promos. That's right, Big Bad John and my friend Billy Superstar Dundee. He was doing it after superstar Billy Graham, but nobody at that time in Memphis had seen Graham. And Dundee, look, it was just the idea of the nickname. It's everywhere. But
and then Dundee decided to wear Macho Man trunks, and it wasn't because he was stealing from Macho Man.
He'd have probably rather have fought Billy Graham than Randy Savage, but that was the kind of the overall scheme of the piece here, was that they didn't delve. They got him in the business, and we'll talk about it, but they didn't delve too much on his career before or afterwards, as much as his incredible run, where he was not only the longest running WWF heel champion ever at that time and for a long time afterwards, but he was also the biggest box office attraction in the business. And just because Vince Sr. had decided he was going to do something, he took the belt off of him and he sent Graham into a depression that he never recovered from. And that was defined the rest of his life practically. But they had more of his family on this one, Brian, than other documentaries we may have seen, including I didn't know he had a son. I remember seeing pictures of him and his daughter vaguely, but his daughter, Capella, great personality, well-spoken. And seemed like she was more hurt about the fact that, as she said, he loved us, but he loved being superstar more. And he wasn't there for them, and he split up with their mother. And the son, until the end of the episode, seemed to hold it more against him for not being there, and even said, he hated him for years over that. But there was more family involvement here than on any of the other retrospectives or anything we've seen about Billy Graham. But the talking heads were strong. Myself, I've made a few cameos. Billy Anderson, who is from Arizona expert. Ken Patera.
Well, Billy Anderson was
in between trips to the loo.
Billy Anderson was really close with Billy Graham for years.
Yes. And well, as I said, they were both from Arizona. And because a lot of people may have thought, well, how did Billy Anderson, I don't think ever intersected career-wise with Graham, but they were hometown buds. And Steve Kern, who worked with him in Florida, Steve Strong, as we mentioned, and Uncle Dave. Really, I'm glad to see him doing that well. They've got a new treatment for broccolitis, where your head slowly turns into a head of broccoli. And I think they're reversing some of the earlier fucking damage. Anyhow.
Broccolitis.
So, broccolitis, yeah. Well, it comes from not washing the broccoli.
Naturally.
So he trained in Calgary with Stu Hart. He meets up with Dr. Jerry Graham, who's a legendary figure in the business and is also a ragingly drunken mental patient. And he ought to be my brother. And that lasted about 2 weeks in Los Angeles. And then Graham got fired. That was when he was Graham had made a comeback, I think around 68 for the Chic in Detroit. And this was like 69, 70 in Los Angeles. And anyway, they
got the photos.
They got the pictures, enough to prove the provenance. And I remember one of the first magazine covers of the London publishing magazines was "This Billy Graham Preaches Violence." And it had him hitting the double bicep with the fringe jacket and the whole thing. And, but while we knew that, at the same time, while he's in Los Angeles, he's working out, and we knew this, he's working out with Arnold Schwarzenegger and their friends, but they were such good friends. See, you'd always think exaggeration in wrestling, right? But they were such good friends. They had pictures where Arnold picked his wife and daughter up at the hospital when she was born, when he had car trouble or whatever. So then he's holding the baby and things. So they skipped over everything through what his first run in the WWF, really, the AWA entirely, but he had already been on top, one of the top heels, major name in the AWA for Vern, and worked programs with Wahoo and Crusher and all those guys.
Marty O'Neill.
Marty O'Neill.
Yeah. I feel bad. I'm sure he was a legend, over there, but whenever I see footage of him, he just looks, maybe it's the glasses, he looks lost. And then you see like early Gene Okerlund, like this guy's got some life to him.
Yeah, Marty O'Neill looked like if Roy Orbison had a blind grandfather.
Was he blind?
I don't know, but he looked like it.
Now I feel bad. Was he blind?
No, I don't think he was. How could he be a blind wrestling announcer?
Well, he was just holding a microphone, looking off like he was blind.
He did commentary too back in the day on those shows. No, he just had the weird glasses.
If he's blind, anyway, I'm so sorry to his family. I just want to say.
None of them are listening to this thing. Are you kidding? Probably by this point, half our regular listeners have given up. So anyway, he's in the WWF, and remember it was him and Ernie Ladd and Ivan Koloff that were the revolving trilogy of top heels in the WWF at that time that were drawing big money anyway. And Vince Sr. made the call to have him be the champion in between Bruno and Backlund. And that's what Graham's son on this said, I hate Bob Backlund. Even though he was mad at his dad, he hated Bob Backlund for beating him for the belt, like poor Backlund called the finish.
Because that started the downfall, was Backlund.
Well, yeah. I mean, that
it could have been Steve Kern. Did they say that in this? They didn't say that in this. It could have been Steve Kern.
No, they didn't bring that up. Maybe they thought nobody believed it. But Vince Sr. wanted an All-American boy, and Kern was already established, and it's not like they were going to send Briscoe, but they had just started Backlund, and they had plans for Backlund in the NWA, you could tell, because he'd already worked St. Louis.
Yeah. He had worked
and
Texas
Graham
also
had
for the Funks.
Yeah, Graham had, well, that was a classic sign of we're sending him try to teach you something to work for the Funks, but Graham had already obviously had plans with him, but he recommended him to Vince Sr., not knowing that would pretty much be Bob's run and the NWA would never get another shot at him. When Graham sent Paul Orndorff to Memphis in 77, when he was a rookie to work for Jerry Jarrett, the footage they sent of Orndorff was working out, doing those Hiro Matsuda fucking badass calisthenics with Bob Backlund. Because there was the only guy in shape enough to fucking, follow that shit because it was the thing where they intertwined legs and did sit-ups together and all that shit. But anyway, they couldn't talk. Graham couldn't talk Vince Sr. out of it. Couldn't talk him out. He thought for sure we're selling out. We're turning him away. He tried to even claim that his knee was hurt or his leg was hurt to match a couple of nights beforehand. And Vince wouldn't buy it.
Yeah, what happens then? Do you just give that up? Like if it's like, oh, fuck, he doesn't believe me. I guess I'll just walk around regular again. Yeah,
well, you you don't put as much effort into limping and, you work out the kinks. Because if it ain't going to work. Because Graham had made a mistake. He had worked the night before in Toronto and he didn't think anybody'd know. But yeah, they were, and it wasn't just the Garden. He had just had the rematch in, I think it was a rematch, or maybe it was the first match in Philadelphia with Bruno. And they'd sold out the Spectrum and turned thousands and thousands away. But anyway, they were going to do it, so they did it. And Graham was already taking pain pills. Google if you can, because I don't remember what year Graham was born in. How old was Billy Graham in 1978? But he was already taking pain pills, and he always looked a little older physically than he was to begin with, and he was getting older by this point. And he had already OD'd a couple of times, according to a couple people's testimony, including his second wife's, Valerie's. So from that point, he kind of left the wrestling business and was just in this depression over having the belt taken away from him and that spot taken away from him. And I think, was it Uncle Dave said he was doing like lawn service or whatever in Arizona? But have you found how old was he?
He was born June 7th, 1943.
Wow, he was 35 years old. But between the steroids working on the joints, the premature balding, and just having a mature face and demeanor, you thought he was older. Because, see, I'd seen the magazines and seen him in The Wrestler, the Vern Gagne version in 74. There was no home video then. The first time I got to see Graham really wrestle, that he had lost the belt to Backlund in February of 78. In like October 1979, he shows up in Memphis, and Jerry Jarrett wanted to establish the CWA World Heavyweight title and have a real name, hold it, and drop it to Lawler. And it was maybe August he showed up. I've got pictures of him and Bockwinkel holding their belts on the same fucking show. But at that point, in the ring, you could tell, and I know now with hindsight, this guy that was used to these fucking giant houses and crowds, he was in Memphis and wasn't the top guy in Memphis, and the fans weren't taking to him like the top guy, and he was phoning it in, and he wasn't taking in really any bumps, and he was, he was doing the promos, but in the ring, the people here in this territory had never seen him before, and he didn't impress anybody. But that's the only place he worked for like a 2 or 3 year period, because Jarrett was able to talk him into it. It was just kind of, being there.
When you say he didn't impress anyone, you're talking obviously as fans that don't look at it as critically as today. Was it in the ring he didn't? Was it that the promos he was doing for the local shows didn't connect? I mean, what wasn't impressive?
The promos were great, but the matches weren't any good because he didn't, besides the fact that he didn't work the Memphis style. He wasn't going to be taking a lot of bumps. He wasn't going to, I don't remember, he was a big bleeder, but I don't remember Graham ever getting juice in Memphis. His work was more see-through. It was in the 70s in the AWA when he had more oomph to him, 10 years, or maybe 6 or 7, he aged quickly. Years before that, he wasn't a polished in-ring performer, but he had more motion to him and working those wild matches with Crusher and Wahoo and all the guys in the AWA. There was movement. And up there in the WWF in the 70s, when it was all about the bigger guys and the slower matches, he kind of could hang in the ring. The promos were incredible. The look was off the charts. But when he got to Memphis, he was cutting the promos, but the life wasn't there. And he was brought in as this guy was the biggest star in the business. You've all read about him. It wasn't like we're going to start from scratch to get this guy over week after week, month after month. He wasn't going to be there forever. And the in-ring, just compared to the guys that were in the Tennessee territory at the time, was just slow, and the shit didn't look right. It didn't look believable. It was a little weaker.
And you like that Nikita Molkovich belt. What'd you think of the CWA belt when they whipped that out?
Oh, good God. I can't remember who it was that they found. Some guy. It was the only wrestling belt ever featuring stained glass. And they found somebody, I think, in Tennessee that made that thing. And it certainly had a different look. But I can't remember. I think Robinson ended up making off with it. I don't think they ever got it back. Billy Robinson, that is. But nevertheless, that was Tennessee. And then he went back to the WWF in 1982 with the bald head and nobody and the karate gimmick. And again, when he came to Memphis, he didn't look in 1979. He didn't look like he did in 1973. But he still had the body, and he had blonde hair, and he was still wearing the tie-dye. But then when he had got back out of the business, and that's when they said he really was bad on pills, and his wife or his daughter said that she was sad looking back on this era because, my God, in 1982, he would have been 39 years old, and he would have passed for 55, right? With some of the old timers that still stay in the ring.
That mustache added like 10 years to his
But
look.
the physique, it not only did he lose weight, but everything drooped, and he would get it back later on a few years later. Somewhat, not, all the way, but that was, you could tell he was not a well person.
Well, plus the karate gimmick.
Oh, God, yeah.
Karate Kid hadn't come out yet, but Bruce Lee had. I mean, there was enough people that had seen enough stuff.
No, Bruce Lee was 10 years old at that point.
Yeah, exactly. You couldn't fool anyone that Billy Graham actually knew karate, so that thing also was, it's not just that he showed up looking like that. He showed up pretending he knows karate.
But you know what? That showed that his confidence had been shattered, that he felt so rejected by that, because they said he'd had his father was never affectionate to him, and his childhood, he was poor, and blah, blah, blah. So the rejection of Vince Sr., he wanted to change his whole fucking thing. And, we know Vince Jr. has said, when that Graham showed up, Vince Jr. was like, what the fuck? That was his prototype for a goddamn pro wrestling champion. And if it had been Vince Jr. instead of Vince Sr., he'd have been Hogan. But instead, he gets, Fu Manchu. And then by the time he gets another run in 86 and 87, his body had given out, and he was 43 years old, and he's hospitalized for the start of all of the hip replacements and joint givings out and hospitalizations and health issues and livers and kidneys and everything. And that was pretty much him as far as a career. But then,
he worked Florida with Kevin Sullivan a bit, which I'm sure if you were partying at the time, that territory may have not been the best place to go.
Well, no, not after the
before. I'm saying before he went back to WWF in 86.
Yeah, but not after he went back in 86, 87. That was it.
Was
right?
He was still there when you were there. When you first got there, he was there, right? Working for Crockett.
Oh shit. No, wait. Yes, because he went from Crockett back to Vince for that last run. Well, we worked with him. We worked with the Midnight Express, worked with superstar Billy Graham and Jimmy Valiant. That was in 85. He went from there to Vince for the last run. And then that's when, his body started giving out. But I mean, and let me just say, a superstar Billy Graham in 1985 cutting the promos for Crockett, he had the tie-dye. He had the goddamn body. He had gotten his shit back together, and he was working at least harder and some better than he had in Memphis 6 years previously. And that Billy Graham, if you'd have kept the one that was in Crockett in 85, he might not have gotten over from scratch if nobody'd ever seen him. But that Billy Graham with that name, he could have fucking had another number of years in the business at that age if his body had not started falling apart. And the hep C and the liver and the joints and everything.
Now, I remember the video of him. I think it was like him giving Steve Lombardi a bear hug, and his back just went out. Like all of a sudden he's giving someone a bear hug, and it's like he's almost like using him to stand himself up.
Yeah.
And that was it. And
I have actually worked in the ring with superstar Billy Graham in handicap matches.
Even the Grand Wizard didn't get to do that.
There you go. See, that's another thing to mark down for me. But
that was the last. But that, you know what?
Yeah,
his hair wasn't coming back. I mean, the reason he got rid of it was going. I think it wasn't coming back. But when he grew the goatee and he had like kind of the look that Scott Steiner would later steal, the multicolored goatee, he looked cool again. Physically, though, he wasn't as withered down as he was as Karate Billy Graham. But he was so pumped up, but he was also just so much older. His body looked older than he was. Now that you know what his age is, like his body looked like Dick the Bruiser era.
Yeah. looked like Bruiser in the Tyndall Armory era of the 80s. I just popped Dave Dynasty and nobody else. But the last scene of this was really sad because his son finally, he was in the hospital in 2023. He'd lived for 20 years after a liver transplant. They were always hearing remember we were talking about it. We're always hearing he's near death. He's on death's door.
He's been dying since 89.
He's been dying for 30 years, whatever. But finally, his son said, well, I got to go see him because his daughter had, and they had a last visit. And the last then phone call that he had with his son was really sad, where they said they loved each other and a blah, blah, blah. But the way the son told it, it was a sad ending to that. But, that was, you can look invincible like Graham did on the outside, but when his confidence was broken or when his self-esteem took a shot or just, having something like that taken away when that was your goal, that pretty much wrecked the rest of his life.
And again, it's that weird thing of being told you're going to have this great thing happen to you and it's going to end at this date. I'm sure he made it much worse than it had to be. But still, it's something that's a crushing blow. It's not like he left the WWF right away. He was still there for a little bit. But whatever he was on, and he may have been on everything at one point in the 70s. Not like the 80s when shit got almost clean.
Yeah, no, the 60s.
Yeah.
When they were mixing it up in toilet bowls.
Physically, you have to wonder, where he was at that point. But, people use the Billy Graham thing to dismiss Backlund's early years before he became really too goofy, or the goofiness didn't work anymore. The howdy-doodiness wore off.
Yeah.
But Backlund was super over, but they were worried. They had Dusty coming in a lot. They had Mil Mascaras, obviously, there the year when Billy Graham was champion, but he was still in the air, so to speak. Bruno was, around. Like, they were trying to make sure there was enough around Backlund to prove himself. And Billy Graham was like the first one of those guys to kind of disappear off the scene. And, Dusty liked him, obviously gave him the chance at Mid-Atlantic, and he went back to work for Vince McMahon. Then he became a manager. And again, he wasn't, he managed The Rock Don Morocco. It was a babyface manager. It didn't work. And then he was on commentary. And, there's a lot of guys. I think Ric Flair's one of them, too. The greatest promos in wrestling history.
Can't do color.
Yeah.
It's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And, but that's the thing. Dusty loved him because, he influenced Dusty. He influenced everybody. And from what I recall, he was a fun guy in the locker room to be around. He just, couldn't take the fall from the top, and a lot of health issues that were brought on or as a result of, some of the various chemicals that he needed to do to get to what he needed to do.